The first snow of 1882 fell on Harlan County, Wyoming, like a secret being whispered to the frozen earth, and Frederick Wells had not expected anyone to be standing on his porch when he heard the knock that would change everything he thought he understood about the remainder of his life. He had been sitting in the dim gray light of late afternoon, the kind of light that presses against a man and makes him feel the full weight of every year he has carried, when the sound came. 3 knocks, deliberate and unhurried, not the frantic hammering of someone in danger, but the careful announcement of someone who had made a decision before raising their fist. Frederick set down the leather harness he had been mending without any particular urgency, rose from the chair beside the cold iron stove, and crossed the plank floor of the cabin he had built with his own hands 11 years before, when he had believed that building something permanent meant something permanent would come to fill it. He was 34 years old, tall and lean in the way that winters and hard work produce in a man, with dark hair beginning to show the first threads of silver at his temples and hands that were calloused past the point of pain from the daily business of running a cattle operation alone. He had brown eyes that people in the town of Harlan sometimes called hard, and he supposed they were right. 8 winters had done that. 8 winters of solitude after Margaret had died in the spring of 1874, 3 days after giving birth to the son who had not survived either, and Frederick Wells had closed the door on every soft thing inside himself with the same quiet determination he brought to every other task that needed doing. He opened the door and the snow came in first, a small rush of cold white, and then he saw her. She was standing on his porch with snowflakes in her dark hair and a carpetbag in each hand, and an expression on her face that was somewhere between exhaustion and a stubborn refusal to be defeated by either exhaustion or snow or whatever the last several days had been for her. She was perhaps 28, perhaps 29, dark-eyed and sharp-featured in a way that was striking rather than merely pretty, with the kind of cheekbones that catch the failing winter light and hold it. Her traveling coat was inadequate for a Wyoming November. That much was immediately obvious. The wool was thin and it was wet at the shoulders and she was shivering, though she was holding herself very still in the way that proud people do when they refuse to let their bodies' distress become a public matter. "I am looking for Frederick Wells," she said, and her voice was steady despite the cold, a warm alto that carried a faint trace of somewhere southern, though she had clearly been working to iron it out. "I was told in town that he runs the largest cattle operation in this valley and that he might have need of a housekeeper. My name is Eudora Dalton. I have references. I came from Cheyenne by stage, and the driver told me the road back to town would be impassable by nightfall with the snow coming on and She paused, and for just a moment the composure slipped, not dramatically, not into tears or pleading, but into something honest and tired. "I am asking if I might come in and speak with you about a position. If you have no need, I understand and I will find another way." She had not finished the asking. She was still speaking, still holding those 2 carpetbags with the knuckles going pale from cold and grip combined, when Frederick Wells did something he had not done in 8 years of winters. He turned back into the cabin, went to the iron stove, opened the grate, and began laying the fire. He did not examine why. He did not give himself the opportunity to think it through and arrive at the sensible conclusion, which would have been to tell this woman that he managed perfectly well alone and that she should go back to town with the stage driver if she could catch him. Instead, his hands moved to the wood box beside the stove, with a certainty that felt less like decision and more like the recognition of something that had already been decided somewhere deeper than thought. He laid the kindling first, then the split pine, and struck the match while she was still standing in the open doorway watching him with those dark eyes that missed nothing. "Come inside," he said, without turning around. "Close the door behind you." She did. The fire caught with a sound like a small held breath releasing, and the orange light of it spread across the interior of the cabin and made everything look less like abandonment than it had a minute before. Eudora Dalton set her carpetbags down beside the door and stood in the warmth that was beginning to grow from the stove, and Frederick Wells straightened up and looked at her properly for the first time in the full light rather than the dimness of the doorway. "Sit down," he said, pulling out one of the two chairs at the kitchen table. "There is coffee from this morning if you want it cold, or I can make fresh." "Fresh would be very kind," she said, sitting down with the careful posture of someone who has been raised to maintain it regardless of circumstance, "though I do not want to be a trouble." "You are already in my cabin," Frederick said, filling the pot from the water pail, "so the question of trouble has been settled." She looked at him for a moment as if measuring whether that was meant to be unfriendly, and then apparently decided it was not, because the corners of her mouth moved in what was almost a smile. "Fair point, Mr. Wells." "Frederick," he said, and then wondered why he had said it, because he had not offered his first name to anyone in a considerable length of time. The coffee was set to boil, and the fire was building warmth in earnest now, filling the cabin with the smell of pine smoke and the sound of crackling wood, and outside the snow was coming down harder, the last of the pale afternoon light disappearing into the solid white of a Wyoming blizzard, getting its intentions organized. Frederick watched it through the single window above the dry sink and understood that the stage driver had been right. Nobody was going anywhere tonight. He sat down across from Eudora Dalton at the table and folded his hands on the scarred wood surface and said, "Tell me about yourself, Miss Dalton." She told him, and the telling of it was honest enough that he found himself listening with more attention than he had given to any human voice in a long time. She had been born in Tennessee, which explained the accent she was working to moderate, the daughter of a schoolteacher who had moved the family west to Kansas when she was 16 following the death of her mother. She had married at 22, a cattle broker named Arthur Dalton, who had been charming and ambitious in the way of men who turn out to be neither reliable nor kind, and had been widowed at 26, when Arthur had made the poor decision to cheat at cards in the wrong establishment in Abilene. She had kept her married name because it was the only one that meant anything west of the Mississippi, and she had spent the last 2 years doing domestic work in Cheyenne, saving money, learning what she could about the territories further north, because she had a theory that a competent woman with a willingness to work hard could make a decent life for herself in the new country if she was willing to move toward it instead of waiting for it to come to her. "And your references," Frederick said. "You mentioned references." She opened the top of one carpetbag and produced a folded envelope with the precision of someone who has rehearsed this moment, and slid it across the table to him. He opened it and read 2 letters from Cheyenne households, both speaking well of her character, her cooking, her management of a household, her reliability. The second letter was from a woman named Clara Hennessy, and the handwriting was warm and the words were specific rather than general, the mark of a reference that was genuine rather than perfunctory. He folded the letters back and returned them to her. Outside, the wind was beginning to lift now, pushing the snow sideways, and the sound of it against the cabin walls was the sound of the world insisting that the 2 people inside had no choice but to remain where they were. "I will tell you what is honest," Frederick said, standing to pour the coffee. "I do not have a housekeeper position. I have not thought about having one. I manage this place alone, which is not easy, but it is functional. What I have is 300 head of cattle, a barn that needs constant attention in winter, fence lines that want checking after every storm, and a way of living that does not accommodate a great deal of company." He set a mug of coffee in front of her and sat back down. "That said, you cannot go back to town tonight, so you will stay here, and in the morning, if the road is passable, I will take you to Harlan myself in the wagon." Eudora wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at him over the rim of it. "And if the road is not passable in the morning, then we will revisit the conversation." She nodded slowly, and there was something in that nod that was not defeat, something that was more like patience, the patience of a woman who has learned that circumstances have their own schedule and that pushing against them only exhausts the pusher. "That is fair, Mr. Wells. Frederick." The way she said his name, correcting herself, trying it out like a word in a language she was still learning, did something unexpected in the region of his chest that he decided immediately not to examine. He made supper instead. It was a simple thing: salt pork and beans and cornbread from a pan, and he set it out on the table with the same spare efficiency with which he did everything. And they ate across from one another with the fire going strong, and the blizzard howling its opinions against the outside walls. And it was the first meal Frederick Wells had eaten with another human being in this cabin in longer than he cared to calculate. She did not fill the silence with noise for the sake of it, which he found himself appreciating with a depth that surprised him. Some people, uncomfortable with quiet, manufactured conversation out of pure anxiety, and it always made Frederick feel that he was expected to perform something he had forgotten how to perform. But Eudora Dalton ate her supper with a kind of composed attention, and when she spoke it was because she had something to say, and when she did not speak it was because silence was appropriate, and the distinction seemed natural to her rather than trained. "This is good," she said, meaning the cornbread, and she said it simply, without excess. "It is a basic recipe," he said. "Most of the best things are." He looked at her. She was looking at her plate, not at him, and her expression was just thoughtful, not angling for anything, and he found that he believed her entirely. The night came down hard and the storm did not ease. Frederick gave Eudora the small back room that had a cot with a wool blanket, a room that had accumulated a fine patina of disuse, and she said nothing about the dust or the emptiness of it, just thanked him with a directness that contained no performance of gratitude, and took a candle, and the sound of the door closing behind her was a sound that somehow made the cabin feel both less and more empty than it had before she had arrived. He sat by the stove for a long time after she had gone to bed, feeding it small pieces of wood, watching the flames, and trying to understand what it was that had moved his hands to that wood box with such certainty before his mind had made any decision at all. He was not a superstitious man. He did not believe in signs or providence or the idea that the universe arranged events for the benefit of individual people. He believed in work and in weather and in the basic calculus of survival, and he had managed those things adequately for 8 years, which was evidence that the calculus had been correct. But he had lit the stove. He had not done that for company in 8 winters, and he had done it before she had even finished asking. He went to bed eventually in the loft above the main room, and he lay there listening to the storm and to the unfamiliar sound of another person's breathing in the small back room below, and he did not sleep easily, but when he finally did, his sleep was different from the gray, restless thing it had been for years. It was deeper. It had weight to it. The storm lasted 3 days. On the morning of the second day, Eudora came out of the back room before Frederick was fully downstairs, and had the coffee on before he reached the bottom step, and he stopped there at the foot of the ladder and looked at her at the stove in the early gray light, and the sight of it was so unexpectedly domestic that something in him tried to retreat from it on reflex before he made himself stand still and simply acknowledge that the sight was not, in fact, terrible. "I hope you do not mind," she said without turning around. "I am not good at sitting idle." "I do not mind," he said. She turned then and looked at him, and for a moment they regarded each other across the small distance of the cabin, with the frankness of 2 people who have spent enough of their lives in close proximity to difficulty that they have stopped pretending not to see things clearly. There were shadows under her eyes that spoke of a night no more restful than his own, and she had her dark hair pinned up with the practical efficiency of someone who had stopped caring about adornment and started caring about function. And she looked, standing there with the coffee in the thin morning light with snow still falling outside the window, like something that belonged there. The thought arrived with such quiet authority that Frederick went to the table and sat down and put both hands flat on the surface as if steadying himself. "The road will not be passable today," he said. "No," she agreed, turning back to the coffee. I need to check on the cattle this morning. The barn will need attending. If you are willing to occupy yourself here, there is salt pork in the cold box and flour in the sack on the shelf, and I would not object to bread if you wanted to make yourself useful." She turned back around and looked at him steadily. "I did not come here to be a burden, Frederick. I will make myself useful." She said his name again with that same careful quality, and again the thing happened in his chest, and again he decided not to examine it, and went to put on his coat and hat and boots, and went out into the blizzard to see to his cattle like a sensible man who knew where his responsibilities lay. The barn was cold and the cattle were restless, packed in tight against the wind that was finding every crack between the boards, and Frederick spent 3 hours there, checking water troughs, distributing hay, examining hooves and hides for signs of trouble, talking to the animals in the low murmur he used with them and never with people, because animals did not require performance and did not judge the quality of the conversation. He had 30 head in the barn, the rest sheltered in the draws and hollows of the pasture, where the geography of the land offered some protection, and he would need to ride out to check on them, but not today, not in this visibility. He came back to the cabin stamping snow from his boots, and was hit by the smell of bread baking, warm and yeasty, and completely incompatible with the way the cabin had smelled for the last several years, and he stood in the doorway for longer than was reasonable before going inside and closing the door. Eudora was at the table writing something in a small notebook, and there were 2 loaves of bread cooling on the windowsill, and the cabin was tidier than it had been in some time, though she had clearly not made a production of the tidying, had simply set things right as she moved through the space doing other things. "The bread will be ready at noon," she said, writing something else, not looking up. "What are you writing?" he asked, removing his coat. "A letter to Mrs. Hennessy in Cheyenne. She will be wondering where I am." She paused, "though I cannot send it until the road is passable." He sat down and watched her write for a moment without meaning to watch her, and then looked away at the fire. "What will you tell her?" "That I was caught in a blizzard and am waiting out the weather at a rancher's property north of Harlan." She looked up then, and there was a very faint edge of something in her expression, not quite amusement but close to it. "She will read it correctly." "What does that mean?" "It means she has a particular imagination," Eudora said, and returned to her letter. Frederick Wells, who had not been made to feel faintly off balance by another person in 8 years, looked at the bread cooling on the windowsill and decided that he needed something to do with his hands, and went to find the harness he had left half-mended the day before. On the 3rd day of the storm, the wind began to ease toward evening and the snow thinned, and they both knew without discussing it that the road would likely be passable by morning. Frederick had spent the previous 2 days in the cabin more than he usually was, the weather making outdoor work impractical except for the necessary barn visits, and they had fallen into a rhythm together with a naturalness that he did not want to inspect too closely, because he suspected that if he inspected it too closely he would find something there that frightened him, and he did not consider himself a man who was easily frightened by anything except the specific terror of attachment. They had talked, which was itself remarkable. Not the constant, obligatory talking of people filling silence, but actual conversation, the kind where each person says something that causes the other to think, and then respond with something genuine. She had told him about Tennessee, and about the particular grief of watching a landscape disappear behind you on the back of a wagon when you are 16, and the landscape is the only home you have ever known. He had told her briefly, without elaboration, about building this cabin and what he had intended it to be, and she had listened without offering condolences or wisdom, which was exactly right. She had told him about 2 years in Cheyenne, which had not been cruel but had been grinding, the work of keeping other people's houses in order while her own circumstances remained unresolved, the particular loneliness of being competent and invisible at the same time. He had understood that without needing it explained, and she had seen that he understood it, and that understanding had passed between them without words, like something warmer than words would have been. She had, on the second evening, asked him about the cattle operation, about how he managed it alone, about the specific mechanics of wintering cattle in Wyoming, and he had found himself talking about it with an enthusiasm he had not brought to conversation in years, because it turned out that she was genuinely interested, asking follow-up questions that demonstrated she had been listening to the previous answers, and that she had some knowledge of her own from having grown up adjacent to cattle country. And the conversation had run past the point where supper was finished and the dishes were washed and the fire needed building up, and he had built it up, and they had kept talking. On the evening of the third day, with the wind settling and the sky beginning to clear to the hard, brilliant black of a Wyoming winter night showing stars, Frederick set down the coffee cup he had been holding and looked at the opposite wall for a moment and then said, "There is no reason you need to go back to Harlan." Eudora was quiet for a moment. "No reason other than the fact that you said you did not have a housekeeper position." "I said I had not thought about one. That was 3 days ago." He looked at her. "I have been thinking about it." She looked back at him with those dark eyes that missed nothing, and she waited, which was one of the things about her that was most disorienting, the waiting without filling space, the willingness to let a person finish their thought. "The operation needs more attention than one person can give it properly," he said. "I have been managing, but managing is not the same as doing a thing well. The cabin has been," he paused, "because honest accounting required accuracy. It has not been kept the way a place should be kept. I have not minded, because there was no one to mind alongside me, and minding alone about the state of a place becomes tiresome after a while. The work is considerable, and the winters are long," and he stopped again, because he was getting close to something that he had intended to approach as a purely practical matter, and that was not remaining purely practical, and he made the decision to be straightforward about it because he was 34 years old and too tired for indirection. "I am asking you to consider staying, Miss Dalton, as a housekeeper, with fair wages, and with the full understanding that if the arrangement does not suit either of us, it can be dissolved with 3 months' notice on either side. It is a practical offer." She did not say anything for a long moment, and he could not read her expression, which was unusual because he had found in 3 days that he could usually read her. "It is a practical offer," she agreed finally. "I would need to know the wages." He named a figure that was on the generous side of reasonable, and she nodded once, the decisive nod of someone who has done the arithmetic and found it satisfactory. "Then I accept," she said, "practically." The word had a weight to it that he chose not to examine just then, and he said, "Good," and reached for the coffee pot. And Eudora Dalton looked at the fire with something in her expression that was not quite a smile, and not quite not one either. The first weeks were a negotiation of space and rhythm. Frederick was a solitary man by long practice, and the habits of solitude are not easily unlearned. And Eudora had her own system of doing things, arrived at through years of managing other people's households, and they moved around each other with the careful attention of two people who are learning the geography of a shared space. There were small frictions, the kind that arise not from genuine conflict but from the collision of individual patterns. He took his coffee with no sugar and liked it strong enough to hold a spoon upright. She took hers with a spoonful of honey when they had it and liked it moderately strong. He was quiet in the mornings until he had been outside and back. She was organized to the point that he sometimes felt that things had been moved from the places where he had always put them to places where they logically ought to be, and he had to retrain himself to find them. But the frictions were small, and the larger thing was that the cabin was alive in a way it had not been. There was the smell of food properly prepared, which was different from the smell of food adequately prepared, though he would not have been able to explain the difference to anyone. There was the sound of another person moving through the space, which he had thought would feel intrusive, and which instead felt, gradually, like something else entirely, something closer to comfort, though he filed that observation away without acting on it. He paid her the first month's wages at the end of November, counting out the coins onto the table with the precision he brought to all financial transactions, and she counted them in turn, not from distrust but from the habit of a woman who has learned to keep her own accounting, and put them in the small purse she kept in the top carpetbag, and said, "Thank you, Frederick," and went back to whatever she was doing. The town of Harlan had opinions, which was not surprising, because small towns in Wyoming Territory in 1882 made opinions about everything with the same industry they brought to farming and ranching. On the first occasion that Frederick drove the wagon into town with Eudora beside him on the seat, he could feel the town noticing, the way a man feels weather coming before it arrives. At the general store, run by a man named Hector Briggs with the professional nosiness of someone who considered it part of his commercial service, Briggs had looked at Eudora and then at Frederick and back at Eudora and said, with elaborate casualness, "New around here, are you?" "Eudora Dalton," she said, extending her hand across the counter with a directness that slightly discomposed Briggs, who shook it by reflex. "I am working for Mr. Wells." "Working?" Briggs repeated, with the emphasis that implied he was leaving room for her to offer further clarification. "As a housekeeper," Eudora said, pleasantly and with absolute finality, and then turned to examine a bolt of cotton fabric on the side shelf, and Frederick found himself looking at the wall behind Briggs with an expression he kept entirely neutral. The minister's wife, a formidable woman named Agnes Proctor, came to the ranch in early December, which Frederick recognized immediately as an inspection. She brought a pie, which was the socially acceptable cover for the visit, and she sat at the kitchen table and ate a piece of it alongside Eudora and asked questions wrapped in pleasantries with the efficiency of someone who had been practicing the form for years. Frederick, who had come in from the barn for coffee, remained at the counter and said nothing, watching Eudora handle Agnes Proctor with a combination of warmth and impenetrability that he found quietly masterful. Eudora had offered her history, the widow from Cheyenne, the references, the practical arrangement, all of it delivered with the calm confidence of a woman who had nothing to hide, and who also was not going to apologize for the facts of her life. Agnes Proctor had left looking, if not entirely satisfied, at least unable to articulate what specifically she objected to, which was the best one could hope for with Agnes Proctor. After she left, Eudora had said, without any particular rancor, "She means well, I think. She is just the kind of woman who believes that meaning well gives her jurisdiction." "That is exactly right," Frederick said, and she had looked at him with a surprised expression, as if she had not expected him to say something like that, and then she had smiled, properly, the first real smile he had seen from her, and it rearranged something in the air of the room. December came down cold and serious, the way Wyoming winters do when they decide to make their point. Frederick rode the fence lines in weather that froze the air in his lungs, checked his cattle in draws and hollows, repaired what broke, replaced what was beyond repair, and came back to the cabin each evening to warmth and food, and, increasingly, conversation that he found himself looking forward to in the way he had once looked forward to nothing. Eudora had begun to learn the operation. Not because he had asked her to, but because she was constitutionally incapable of being in proximity to a thing and not understanding how it worked, and she asked him questions about the cattle, about the land, about the economics of the operation, about Wyoming Territory itself, its politics and its geography and the particular character of the people who had come here. He told her what he knew, which was considerable, and found that explaining things he had always simply known required him to think about them differently, and thinking about them differently was interesting in a way he had not anticipated. She had begun, quietly, without making it a negotiation or an announcement, to take on tasks that were outside the original scope of what they had discussed. She had repaired the chicken coop, which had been in a sorry state, with wood from the scrap pile and a hammer she found in the barn. She had organized the pantry with a system that was so self-evidently logical that he could not understand why he had never done it himself. She had mended several things of his that needed mending, including a coat that he had been wearing with a torn lapel for 2 winters, and when he had found it folded on the chair with the repair so neat as to be invisible, he had stood there for longer than was reasonable, holding the coat. He had carried it to the doorway of the main room where she was reading and held it up and said, "You did not need to do this." She looked up from the book. "I know." He looked at the coat. "Thank you, Eudora." The way he said her name was different from the way he had been saying it for the first weeks, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so, and he put the coat on the hook and went back to what he had been doing, and she went back to her book, and the fire burned steadily between them. It was the middle of December when the situation with the Harker brothers came to complicate things in a way that clarified other things, as complications sometimes do. The Harker brothers, Wade and Clem, ran a smaller cattle operation about 12 miles to the east and had been making noise for 2 seasons about water rights on Piney Creek, which ran through the north edge of Frederick's property, and which had historically been available to both operations through an informal agreement. The agreement had been informal because it had never needed to be formal, but Wade Harker had recently taken up with a land attorney from back east named Sylvester Pell, who had the kind of ambition that feeds on other people's property. And together, they had been suggesting that the water rights were exclusively Harker land, and that Frederick had been using them without legal standing. Frederick had not paid the suggestion much attention because it was legally without merit. He had the original land grant papers, and the water rights were clear in them, but he had perhaps underestimated how far Pell's ambition would take him. On a gray afternoon in mid-December, Wade Harker rode into the yard with Pell and 2 other men, and Frederick came out of the barn to meet them with the steady, unhurried movement of a man who has met trouble before and is not going to pretend otherwise. The conversation was not pleasant. Pell had a document that he claimed established a prior claim to Piney Creek, and he delivered it with the smooth confidence of a man who deals in other people's uncertainty. Frederick took the document and looked at it with the thoroughness it required, and then looked up at Pell and said, "This is a forgery." The yard went quiet in the specific way that yards go quiet when something is about to either escalate or back down. "That is a serious accusation," Pell said. "It is an accurate one," Frederick said. "The date on this document is 1869. The original plat for this section was filed in 1871. A claim that precedes the plat by 2 years would require the territory to have established a water rights registry before the land was surveyed, which it did not do." He handed the document back to Pell. "I do not know where you found this, or who made it for you, but it will not hold up before a judge, and I think you know that. I would recommend you take it back east with you, and put it somewhere it cannot cause you any more embarrassment." Pell had taken the document, and ridden off with Wade and Clem Harker and the other 2 men, and the embarrassment of the retreat had made Pell's face do interesting things on the way out of the yard. Frederick had watched them go, and then turned back toward the barn and found Eudora standing in the cabin doorway, having apparently watched the entire exchange through the window. "You knew about the land grant papers," she said. "I know everything about the papers that describe what is mine," he said. She looked at him for a moment with something new in her expression, something that was not quite evaluation and not quite admiration, but was somewhere in the vicinity of both. "Yes," she said, "I imagine you do," and she went back inside. He stood in the yard for a moment in the cold and looked at the closed door, and then looked up at the sky, which was the particular dense white of a sky that is thinking about more snow, and breathed out a long breath that steamed in the air, and told himself firmly that he was not going to be undone by a look from a woman who was his employee, and who was in a professional arrangement with him, and who was not going to be made uncomfortable by him developing feelings that had not been invited. He went back to the barn. He did not go back to the barn fast enough. The feelings, which had been growing with the stealth that all the most significant things grow with, had by this point developed opinions of their own that were difficult to ignore in the privacy of one's own mind. He found himself aware of her in a way that was inconvenient and constant. The sound of her moving around the cabin in the early morning, the way she held her coffee cup in both hands when she was thinking about something, the fact that she laughed rarely, and when she did it was quiet and genuine, and made him want to earn it again. The way she looked out at the land on clear mornings, with an expression that was not the expression of someone tolerating the landscape, but of someone who was genuinely learning to love it. He did nothing about any of it, because he was Frederick Wells and he had not survived 8 years of deliberate solitude by acting on the first thing that moved in his chest, and because the arrangement between them was a professional one, and because she had come to him out of practical necessity and had agreed to stay on practical terms, and she had not given him any indication that she experienced the arrangement as anything other than what it was stated to be, except that she had mended his coat, and she had made the bread, and she watched him sometimes. He had caught her at it 2 or 3 times, with an expression that she put away quickly when she saw he had noticed, the way you put away something you are not ready to discuss. Christmas came to Harlan County in 1882 with the particular warmth that the holiday generates even in places where warmth requires active effort. Frederick was not a man who had observed Christmas with any ceremony since Margaret, but Eudora had a different relationship to the holiday, having grown up in a household where her father had made it a point of significance regardless of the material circumstances of the year, and she had made small preparations that were neither extravagant nor ignorable. A wreath of pine on the door, a candle in the window, a tin of cookies baked with the last of the sugar. And on Christmas morning, a package on the table wrapped in brown paper. Frederick looked at it for a moment before looking at her. "It is not much," she said from the stove. "I found the leather in town when we went for supplies." He opened it and found a pair of gloves, calfskin, lined with wool, sewn with the neat, competent stitching he had come to recognize as hers. They were perfectly sized, which meant she had looked at his hands and gauged them with attention, and the thought of that attention moved through him with a force that was entirely out of proportion to a pair of gloves. He put them on. They fit exactly. "They are excellent," he said, and his voice came out differently than he intended it to, with a roughness at the edge of it that was not habitual. She turned from the stove and looked at him with his new gloves on, and something passed across her face that she did not entirely succeed in putting away before he saw it. Then she said, "Merry Christmas, Frederick," and turned back to the stove. He had gotten her something too. He had been in Harlan 3 weeks earlier for supplies and had stopped at Briggs's store, and at the back of the store, mostly buried under a stack of feed catalogs, he had found a book, a collection of essays by a naturalist who had traveled the Western Territories, and he had bought it on an impulse that he had justified to himself as being appropriate given that she was reading everything in the cabin that could be read, and the selection was limited. He had wrapped it in brown paper the same way she had wrapped the gloves, and he produced it now from the shelf where he had been keeping it, and set it on the table. She opened it and was quiet for a long moment, reading the cover, then opening the frontispiece, then reading the first line of the first essay. He watched her read and watched the quality of her stillness shift into the quality of stillness that is pure absorption. "Frederick," she said finally. "It was at Briggs's," he said. "It is perfect," she said. And then quietly, "How did you know?" "You were reading the almanac last week," he said, for the second time. She looked up from the book and looked at him, and the look was longer than the ones before, and had more in it, more of the things she had been putting away when he noticed her looking, and this time she did not put it away. He sat down at the table, closer to her than he usually sat, and she remained where she was and did not shift away, and they looked at each other in the Christmas morning light with the stove burning warm between them, and the things that had been accumulating between them in the months since she had knocked on his door in the first snow were, in that moment, approximately as clear as the Wyoming sky after a storm. He was still afraid of it. He would have been a fool not to be. He had loved someone before, and the loss of that loving had remade him into a man who lived behind his own walls. And the walls had held for 8 years, and they were coming down in the presence of a woman who had not asked them to, and who was, if he was reading her correctly, conducting her own separate war with her own walls for her own reasons. But he was also tired, in the way that a man gets tired not of work but of emptiness, and the tired part of him was increasingly more convincing than the afraid part. "Eudora," he said. "Yes," she said, which was not a question. "I want to tell you something that is outside the terms of our arrangement." She set the book down on the table and gave him her full attention. "I am not a man who says things easily. I have not said things to another person in a long time because there was no one I wanted to say them to, which was a condition I had become accustomed to and had stopped questioning. And then you came here in the snow, and I lit the stove for you before I had thought about whether I was going to, and I have been thinking about that ever since." He stopped. The fire crackled. The wind was quiet outside for once. "I do not want to say anything that makes you feel obligated or uncomfortable, or that complicates the arrangement in a way that is unwelcome. But I think you ought to know that the arrangement, for me, is not primarily practical anymore." She was quiet for long enough that he began to go through the various outcomes of this disclosure, most of which were uncomfortable and several of which were bad, and he sat with them with the patience of a man who has made his statement and cannot unmake it. "When I left Cheyenne," she said finally, "I had a very clear idea of what I was going to, and a very uncertain idea of what I was going toward. I knew what I was leaving. 2 years of work that was good work, honest work, but that was always in someone else's home, on someone else's terms, building towards something I could not quite see. I came north because I wanted to be somewhere that had not already been shaped by someone else's life. I wanted land that still had room in it." She looked at him steadily. "I did not expect to knock on a door and have the man inside light the stove before I had finished asking. That is not a thing that happens and then means nothing." He looked at her. "I have my own reasons for moving carefully," she said. "Arthur was not a good man in the way that certain men are not good in ways you do not discover until you are already committed to them. I learned things from that about my own judgment and about trust, and about the difference between a man who is charming and a man who is genuinely good." She met his eyes. "I have been watching you since November, Frederick. I have been watching how you treat your animals and how you handle trouble and how you talk to people and how you manage this land. I have been watching what kind of man you are when you think no one is specifically examining you." "And," he said, "you are a genuinely good man," she said simply, "which is rarer than people in polite company like to acknowledge." He reached across the table and she did not move her hand away, and he covered it with his, the new glove still on, and the warmth of the glove and the warmth beneath it were two different things and both of them mattered. "I am proposing a different kind of arrangement," he said. "I know what you are proposing," she said. "I am making it formal," he said, "because I want to be clear, and because you deserve something clear after what was apparently not clear enough before." She turned her hand over under his so that their palms were together and her fingers closed around his, and she said, "Ask me then." "Will you allow me to court you?" he said, "properly, with the full intention that it leads somewhere permanent, if you find that you want that." Outside, a cardinal, inexplicably present in a Wyoming winter, landed on the porch rail and was visible through the window, a small red shock of color against the white. Eudora looked at it briefly and then looked back at him. "Yes," she said, "I will allow that." The courtship of Frederick Wells and Eudora Dalton was conducted with the particular quality of attention that belongs to people who have both been through things that taught them not to take warmth for granted. He brought her wildflowers in the spring, when the land thawed and the meadows along Piney Creek produced the extravagant yellow and blue of the first warm weeks, and she pressed one of them in the back of the naturalist's book between its pages. He drove her to town for the spring dance that Harlan held in May in the space behind the general store, and he danced with her, badly but willingly. and she laughed that quiet, genuine laugh that he had been trying to earn, and he held her hand on the drive home under a sky that was the full, deep purple of a Wyoming spring evening going to night. She showed him things he had not known were in the land around his own property. A spring that fed a small grove of aspens half a mile from the cabin that she had found on one of her walks, the kind of place that looked, in the late afternoon light, like something that had been placed there on purpose. She had stood in it with her hands at her sides, and her face turned up to the light coming through the new leaves, and he had watched her from the edge of it and understood something about her that was larger than what words were adequate to. Agnes Proctor came back in April, no longer on an inspection, but on what appeared to be a genuine change of position, because she had watched Frederick Wells and Eudora Dalton in church on 2 successive Sundays and had arrived at conclusions that apparently satisfied her. She had taken Eudora aside after the second Sunday service and said something in a low voice, and Eudora had smiled at her with warmth that was entirely genuine, and Frederick had watched from across the churchyard and understood that this was the town deciding to accept her, which was the town's gift to give or withhold, and which she had earned without performing anything. The matter of the Harker brothers resolved itself in March, when Sylvester Pell, presumably having realized that his forgery was not going to get him anywhere useful, had left Harlan and gone back east, and without Pell's particular species of ambition driving it, the water rights dispute had deflated entirely. Frederick had run into Wade Harker at Briggs's store in April, and Wade had shaken his hand with the shamefaced grip of a man who knows he was being steered badly and is glad to be out of the canyon, and they had returned to the informal agreement that had served both operations for years, which was what sensible neighbors in cattle country did when they stopped listening to lawyers from back east. By June, which arrived in Wyoming with the exuberance of a country that has been cold for too long, and is making up for it with wildflowers and long evenings and warm nights that smell of sage and new grass, Frederick had been rehearsing something for approximately 3 weeks and could no longer find a satisfactory reason to continue rehearsing it instead of saying it. He took her to the aspen grove in the late afternoon of a Saturday, on the pretense of checking the creek for the water level, which was the kind of thin pretense that she probably saw through immediately, but was kind enough not to say so. They stood in the filtered light of the grove with the aspens moving slightly in the warm air and the sound of water somewhere below them, and he said her name. Eudora. Frederick. He turned to face her, and she was already looking at him with that expression she had stopped putting away, the one that had everything in it that she had been managing since November, and he said, "I would like to marry you, if you are willing. I want to do this properly, and I want to be entirely clear. I want to build something here with you that is not a practical arrangement or a temporary convenience but a permanent life. My permanent life, if you will share it." She looked at him for a long moment, the aspens moving behind her, the light doing things in her dark hair, and then she stepped toward him and put her hands on the front of his shirt with the calm deliberateness of someone who has made a decision from the fullness of themselves, and not from fear or necessity or anything other than wanting. "I am willing," she said. "I have been willing for some time, Frederick Wells. I was waiting for you to be ready." He took her face in his hands and kissed her, under the aspens in the June light, and the kiss was nothing like the careful, controlled man he had been building himself into for 8 years. It was like the first fire of winter, enormous and necessary and illuminating everything. They were married in August of 1882 in the Harlan church, on a morning that the weather cooperated with by producing the particular clear golden August light that makes Wyoming look like the version of paradise that is practical and wind-scoured and vastly better than the soft, lush kind. Reverend Proctor performed the ceremony with the earnest goodwill of a man who has been observing the situation since November and is pleased with how it has resolved. Agnes Proctor sat in the front pew with an expression of entirely unironic satisfaction. Hector Briggs was there, and Clara Hennessy had come up from Cheyenne, which had made Eudora's face do something that Frederick would remember for the rest of his life. The particular look of a woman who has been largely alone and is seen, fully and warmly seen, by someone who has known her a long time. When Reverend Proctor pronounced them married and Frederick kissed his wife in the golden August light of the Harlan church, the small congregation of people who had been paying attention since the November blizzard made sounds of approval that were as genuine as approval gets in small western towns, and Agnes Proctor made a sound that was entirely indistinguishable from a sniffle, which she would deny to her dying day. They drove back to the ranch in the wagon, just the two of them, the late morning sun on the land that was both his and hers now in the complete sense, and Eudora sat beside him on the wagon seat with her shoulder against his and the new band on her finger catching the light, and she said, "You know what I have been thinking about since November?" "The stove," he said. She looked up at him with slight surprise. "I have been thinking about it too," he said. "You did not even hesitate," she said. "I was standing in your door in the snow with 2 bags and a story, and you turned around and lit that stove before I had even finished asking." "Yes," he said. "What made you do it?" He was quiet for a moment, watching the land open up ahead of them, the long grass moving in the warm August wind, his cattle visible in the distance as dark shapes against the gold. "I cannot explain it as a thought I had," he said. "It was more that my hands already knew what they were going to do before the rest of me had been consulted." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your hands were right." "They usually are," he said. "I have had to consult them more on the important things." She laughed, quiet and genuine, the laugh he had spent months earning and now got to hear every day, and she tucked her hand into the bend of his elbow and leaned her head against his shoulder, and they rode home through the August warmth, and the cabin that had been empty for 8 winters was not going to be empty anymore. The autumn was a different kind of season once it came with Eudora in it. Frederick had always been competent in the autumn, the necessary work of preparing for winter, putting up stores, getting the cattle sorted, repairing what needed to be in order before the cold arrived. But he had always done it with the grim efficiency of necessity rather than anything that resembled pleasure. This autumn had a different quality entirely, because everything he did he came back from to find her there, and everything she did was part of the same preparation, and the preparation was for a winter they were going to face together, and the facing together of things is the thing that makes work mean something beyond its own completion. She took a horse, which she had not told him she could ride until the day in September when she had simply asked him which horse had the best temperament, and climbed onto the bay mare called Patience and ridden out across the south pasture with a competence that was clearly long established. He had watched her from the fence, and when she came back he said, "You rode before." "My father believed girls should ride," she said, swinging down from Patience with ease. He was ahead of his time in some respects. After that she rode out with him sometimes to check the cattle, and having someone beside him on the fence lines was something he adjusted to with a speed that told him how much he had wanted it without knowing he wanted it. She had a good eye for the cattle, could read their condition and behavior in the practical way of someone who had grown up adjacent to livestock, and she was forthright about what she thought without being aggressive about it, which was the correct way to be in a working partnership. In November, close to the anniversary of the storm that had brought her to his door, Eudora told him she was pregnant. She told him in the kitchen on a quiet morning, with the same directness she brought to everything, standing at the table with her coffee cup in both hands, looking at him with an expression that contained both the news and a question about how the news would be received. He sat down slowly. The memory of 1874 was in the room with them, unavoidable, because he had told her about Margaret, told her fully and honestly in the way that love between adults who have both been through things requires, and she knew what this particular news meant in the context of that history. "Rick," she said, and her voice was very steady, the steadiness of a woman who is managing more than one thing at once. He got up and went to her and held her, just held her with his arms around her and her face against his shoulder, and she let herself be held without the careful composure she usually maintained, and he said into her hair, "We will be all right." "I know," she said, and after a moment quieter, "I am a little frightened." "So am I," he said. "We will be frightened together then." She made a sound against his shoulder that was partly a laugh and partly something more complicated. He held on. The winter was as cold as Wyoming winters always are. But inside the cabin it was warm in a way that had nothing to do with the stove and everything to do with what the stove represented. The daily decision to tend the fire, to keep the warmth going, to maintain the conditions in which a life can be lived. Frederick watched over Eudora with a care that she sometimes found excessive, and which she told him so with the frank affection that had become the currency of their daily life together. And he acknowledged the excess and continued it anyway, because some fears are not rational and do not respond to reason, only to the passage of time and the accumulation of evidence. In the deep of December, the territory received more snow than usual days of it, and the cabin was its own world for stretches at a time, warm and provisioned and sufficient. And on the long evenings they sat by the stove and she read to him, which was something she had begun doing in the autumn because she had discovered that he liked being read to in the same way that certain people like music, as a background to thought rather than a demand on attention. She was reading the naturalist's book, The Christmas Gift, working through it methodically, and her voice in the quiet evenings was the sound of the cabin being fully inhabited, fully alive. He told her things in those winter evenings that he had not told anyone. About his childhood in Ohio, which was far enough away to be nearly fictional, the farmer's son who had read everything he could get his hands on, and decided at 17 that the West was the place where a person could build something that was genuinely theirs. About the crossing, which had taken 2 years and a great deal of difficulty, and had remade him from an Ohio farm boy into something that could survive Wyoming. About Margaret, more than he had told before, the full version, not just the facts of the loss but the person who had been lost, because Eudora had made it clear that she was not frightened by the presence of the dead in a life, that it was possible to honor what had been while being fully present in what was, and he had found that she was right. She told him more, too, in those evenings. About the specific quality of her loneliness in Cheyenne, which was not the dramatic loneliness of novels but the quiet, ordinary kind, the loneliness of competence without partnership, of waking up in someone else's house and making it comfortable, and then going to bed in the corner of it. About her father, who had been the best thing in her childhood, and who had died in Kansas of a fever when she was 20, 3 years before Arthur, and whose loss had left her for a long time without the kind of grounding that a person needs to make good decisions. She thought, she said, that Arthur had been a decision made without that grounding, without someone to ask whether the charm was real. "Is there someone now?" Frederick asked. "To ask?" She looked at him with a warmth that was direct and unhesitating. "There is you," she said. The child was born in July of 1883, a boy, healthy and loud, and bearing a strong resemblance to his father in the matter of the dark hair, and a strong resemblance to his mother in the matter of the expression, which was attentive and evaluating from the first days, as if he had arrived with opinions already formed and was simply gathering evidence to confirm them. They named him Thomas James Wells, Thomas for her father, James for a brother of Frederick's who had been lost in the war before either of them had been old enough to understand what war cost. Eudora's recovery was straightforward, which Frederick allowed himself to believe was evidence that the worst of what he feared was not fated to repeat, and by August she was herself again, which meant moving through the world with the competent energy that had characterized everything she did, now with Thomas in a sling against her chest while she did it, which was an adjustment of remarkable efficiency. The ranch changed shape around the family. Frederick hired a hand in the autumn, a young man named Samuel Reeves, who was 19, and had come to Wyoming from Missouri, with the unformed ambition of a person who needs work to give the ambition direction. Samuel was a quick learner and not afraid of cold or difficulty, and Frederick found him reliable in the way that mattered, which was not spectacular performance but consistent presence. Having Samuel meant that certain things could be done that had been impractical for one man. Fence lines checked more regularly, cattle moved more efficiently, the operation running at something closer to its potential. Eudora took Samuel's meals as part of her ordinary routine, feeding him at the kitchen table in the mornings and evenings, and she treated him with the practical warmth she gave to most things, neither making a production of kindness nor withholding it for no reason. And Samuel, who had come from a family where warmth was rationed, responded to this with a fierce loyalty to the Wells household that expressed itself in hard work and a willingness to do whatever the day required. Thomas grew at the speed that infants conduct their most important business, which is to say with a rapidity that made Frederick periodically lose track of what week it was, because the child seemed to be doing something new every time he looked. Sitting up, pulling himself along the floor, standing at the furniture with the determined concentration of someone who has a project to complete. The first word, which was, to Frederick's private satisfaction, the word for horse, and to Eudora's private and vocal amusement, also to the satisfaction of the bay mare called Patience. The second winter they spent as a family had its own quality, which was the quality of a thing that has been established, that has roots now, that does not need to be built from the beginning each morning. Frederick still lit the stove in the early mornings, still made the first coffee, still went out to the barn in the dark before full dawn, but these things were now part of a fabric that had other threads in it. The sound of Thomas in the back room, Eudora's voice talking to him in the mornings, the particular domestic geography of a home that is properly inhabited. On the 1-year anniversary of their wedding, he found a letter on the kitchen table addressed to him in her handwriting. He opened it at the table in the early morning before she was up, and it was 3 pages of her particular handwriting, contained and clear, and it said the things that she had told him in various ways over the course of the year, but written down had a different weight, the weight of things meant to be kept, and the things she said about him were things he would not have known to hope for from another person's account of who he was. And he read the letter twice, and then folded it carefully and put it in the inside pocket of his coat where the fold of old letters lives in a man's life. And when she came downstairs with Thomas on her hip, he was still sitting at the table, and he looked at her and said nothing for a moment because there was too much to say and nothing that was adequate, and she looked at him and knew, and she said simply, "Happy anniversary, Frederick," and he said, "Come here," and she came, and he held her and Thomas both, the whole of what his life had become, and outside the Wyoming morning was doing its slow progression from dark to gray to the first cold gold of a new day. In the spring of 1884, Eudora told him she was pregnant again, and this time, while the fear was still present, it was smaller, because they had the evidence of Thomas against it, and because Eudora herself seemed different in the way she carried the news, not the careful steadiness of the first time, but something more like the quiet confidence of a woman who has done this and knows the shape of it. The pregnancy was healthy through the summer, and in October of 1884 their daughter arrived, named Clara after Clara Hennessy in Cheyenne, who had sent a letter of such warm congratulation that Frederick had read it, and thought that he was glad Eudora had that friendship, the long kind that knows a person's history. Clara was different from Thomas in the way that siblings always reveal the way's character arrives already formed, quieter and more watchful, with Eudora's dark eyes and Frederick's particular stubborn patience. Where Thomas approached the world with an investigative confidence, Clara observed first and then moved, and she had at 9 months an expression that Frederick caught himself thinking of as judicial, as if she was taking evidence before reaching verdicts. The operation continued to grow. By 1885, Frederick had expanded the herd to 400 head, and with Samuel's help and occasional additional labor in the busy seasons, the economics of the thing were significantly better than they had been during the solitary years. He put money aside with the discipline he brought to all financial matters, not from miserliness, but from the forward-looking habit of a man who has built something from nothing and understands that it must be maintained. He had also, and this was something he had done quietly, put money aside for a particular purpose he had been developing since Thomas was born. There was a section of land adjacent to his property to the south, about 300 acres, that had been unoccupied since its original claimant had given up on it in 1879 and gone back to wherever he had come from. Frederick had made inquiries through the Territorial Land Office and had established that the claim had reverted and the land was available, and in the spring of 1885 he filed on it. He told Eudora over supper on the day the papers came back confirmed, sliding them across the table to her, while Thomas was occupied with a piece of cornbread and Clara was asleep in her basket in the corner. She read the papers and looked up at him. "Frederick, the pasture on the south side has been the limiting factor," he said. "With the additional acres we can run 600 head without difficulty, and the spring I showed you, the Aspen Grove, is on the southern boundary of the new section." Her expression moved through several things and arrived at something that was entirely itself, not any of the expressions he had catalogued before, a new one, compounded of gratitude and recognition and love that was not the careful early version but the version that has been living in a house for 3 years and knows all the rooms. "The Aspen Grove," she said. "It should be ours," he said. "Properly." She got up from the table and came around it and kissed him with the directness she brought to everything. And Thomas looked up from his cornbread and said something disapproving and then went back to the cornbread. And Clara slept on, and the fire in the stove was burning well, as it had been since November of 1882, as it would go on burning. The summer of 1885 brought a cattle buyer from Denver named Harlan Cross, who had heard about the Wells operation, and arrived with serious money, and an offer to take the entire autumn drive at a price that was considerably above what Frederick had been getting from the local buyers. Frederick negotiated the agreement over 2 days of careful conversation, in which Eudora participated with a directness that Harlan Cross had not expected from a rancher's wife, and which Frederick watched with quiet satisfaction. She asked the questions about the Denver market that Frederick had been thinking but had not yet asked, and Cross answered them with the slightly startled respect of a man who is being surprised pleasantly, and the final terms of the agreement were better than the opening offer in ways that were traceable directly to 2 of Eudora's questions. After Cross had ridden out, Frederick had looked at her and said, "You have been paying attention." "I have been paying attention since November of 1882, she said. "This is my operation, too." It was, and he had always meant it to be, but hearing her say it with that full ownership was something different from knowing it. "Yes," he said, "it is." She looked at him for a moment with the specific expression she had for moments when something has been confirmed that was important to her. Then she went back to what she was doing, and he went back to what he was doing, and the operation that was both of theirs went forward into the autumn. The autumn drive was the most successful one the Wells Ranch had executed, and Frederick came back from Denver with money that represented, for the first time, genuine prosperity rather than adequate survival, and he sat down with Eudora that evening and spread the accounts on the table, and they went through them together, which was how they made all the consequential decisions, both of them looking at the same numbers and thinking about them from different angles. And the decisions that came out of those conversations were consistently better than the ones he had made alone. They talked about the future with the same frankness they brought to everything else. The children would need schooling, which was available in Harlan but could be better, and they would think about that as the years went on. The cabin itself, which had been adequate for 2 people, and which was becoming crowded with 2 adults and 2 children, and a hired hand taking meals there, wanted adding to, a project for the next spring. The operation had room to grow, but growth required thought, not just ambition, and they were both constitutionally opposed to the kind of ambition that outruns thought. Thomas was 2.5 and Clara was 1, and the cabin in the evenings had the productive chaos of a household with young children, which is to say that it was never entirely quiet and never entirely ordered, and was constantly full of evidence of small lives being actively conducted. Frederick, who had spent 8 years in stillness, found the chaos not distressing but its opposite. The noise and the disorder and the perpetual small demands of parenthood were the sounds of the thing he had been without and had not known, until November of 1882, how much he had been without. He built the addition onto the cabin in the spring of 1886, a back bedroom for the children that was properly sized, and had a window that looked out toward the south pasture and the far line of the aspens, and a small room off the kitchen that Eudora could use for her own things, the writing, the books, the accounts she kept, because she needed a place that was specifically hers in a house that was full of shared purposes. He built it himself on the days when Samuel could hold down the ranch work alone, and it took the better part of 3 months, and when it was done, she walked through it and put her hand on the window frame of her room and looked out at the aspens with an expression that was the Aspen Grove expression, the one where the light falls on her face and she is present in it completely. "It is exactly right," she said. In the summer of 1886, Clara Hennessy came north from Cheyenne to visit, and the cabin held her with the ease of a house that knows how to make room, and the two women spent evenings on the porch talking in the quiet voices of long friendship, while Frederick sat inside with Thomas climbing on him, and Clara asleep against his shoulder, and he could hear their voices without hearing the words, and the sound of them was the sound of Eudora being known by someone who had known her long. And it was a sound he was glad of. Clara Hennessy went back to Cheyenne with the September supply stage and told Frederick before she left, with the directness of a woman who has been watching and thinking and is going to say what she observed. She was looking for something specific when she came north. She did not know it was you, but she would know it if she found it. She found it. She looked at him with a considering expression. "Take care of her." "I intend to," he said. "She will take care of you too," Clara said. "She already has been. You should see yourself now, compared to what she described." He did not ask what she had described, but he thought about it for a while after the stage had gone. The years that followed were the years of a life built well and inhabited fully. Frederick Wells and Eudora Wells, whose name had become Wells with the same natural completeness that her presence had become part of the ranch, built what they had intended to build, not in the dramatic fashion of stories that require constant crisis to justify their telling, but in the steady accumulating fashion of two people who know what they want and work toward it every day. A third child arrived in 1888, another boy, named Joseph Henry Wells, who came into the world with a constitution that suggested he had heard about Wyoming winters and had decided to come ready for them, solid and determined and loud in his opinions from the first day. Frederick, holding him in the delivery room while Doc Garrison attended to Eudora, had looked down at this third person he and Eudora had made and felt something he had no adequate language for, which was fine, because the adequate language for such things is never words anyway. Thomas, who was 5 when Joseph arrived, received his brother with the magnanimous generosity of a child who has never known deprivation and therefore has nothing to protect, and immediately began planning the education of the newcomer with the organizational confidence he had inherited directly from his mother. Clara, who was 3, observed Joseph with the judicial expression she had been perfecting since infancy, and after 2 days of observation, apparently reached a verdict in his favor, because she began spending a great deal of time beside the cradle watching him with the proprietary air of a person taking on a responsibility. The school in Harlan became better in 1889 when a new teacher arrived from the East, a graduate of a teacher's college in Ohio named Miss Abigail Forrest, who was 26 and serious about education in the way that makes children actually learn, and Thomas Wells was among her first students in the fall of that year. Eudora drove him into town on the first day of school herself, in the buggy that had replaced the old wagon for family errands, and Thomas had gone in with the confidence of a child who has been talked to like a person his whole life, and has therefore developed the expectation that the world is a place that makes sense. On the drive back, Eudora had been quiet in the way that was not emptiness but processing, and Frederick, riding alongside on his horse because he had a fence to check north of town, had watched her in the buggy and waited. "He looks like you," she said finally. "He has your brain," he said. She smiled at the road ahead of them. "He has both of ours, I think. That seems right." The Piney Creek water rights, which had never been formally contested after Sylvester Pell's departure, were formalized in 1889 by an agreement between Frederick and Wade Harker that was drawn up by a proper land attorney, not because either of them mistrusted the other, but because formal agreements are better than informal ones in a world where informal agreements depend on the continued presence of the parties who made them. Wade Harker had married the year before, a practical woman named Ruth who was well suited to him, and the two couples had a working relationship that was cordial and occasionally social without being close, which was exactly the right degree of relationship for neighboring ranchers in a territory where proximity to another person's land is a daily fact. The operation reached 500 head by 1890, and Frederick hired a second hand, a man named Ed Torres who had been working cattle operations throughout the territory, and who had a depth of knowledge about the particular challenges of Wyoming winters that was immediately valuable. Ed was 31, quiet and competent, and he and Samuel had the complementary dynamic of two people whose skills are different enough to expand each other's capabilities. In the winter of 1890, on the first anniversary she could remember clearly, the anniversary of the first snow and the knock on the door and the stove, Eudora came to find Frederick in the barn on a late November afternoon when the snow was falling outside in the exact way it had fallen on the day she had arrived, soft and serious and without apology. He was at the workbench doing something to a bridle, and she came and stood beside him, and he looked up at her. "It is snowing," she said. "I know." 8 years ago today," she said, "approximately, give or take a day." He set down the bridle. "I have been thinking about it all week." She leaned against the workbench and looked at him with the full look, the one that had everything in it. "What would you have done if I had not knocked, if the storm had not come when it did?" He thought about it honestly. "Continued," he said. "Managed, done what I had been doing." He looked at her. "It would have been a smaller life. For both of us," she said. He reached over and touched her face, the simple gesture that was still something real every time, and she turned her head slightly into his hand in the way she always did. Outside the barn, the snow fell on the land that was both of theirs, on the cabin with the warm light in the windows, on the aspen grove to the south where the bare trees stood silver in the winter light, on the fence lines and the pastures and the whole of the thing they had built. "You knocked," he said. "That was the only requirement." "You lit the stove," she said. "That was the answer." He looked at her in the warm, dim light of the barn, this woman who had come to his door in the first snow with 2 carpetbags and an honest question, and who had been the best thing that had come to him in a life that had had some things worth counting. And he thought about the hands that had known before the mind had, about the certainty that had moved him to the wood box before he had thought about it at all. And he thought, as he had thought many times since, that there are things a man understands only in retrospect, but that understanding them in retrospect is not less valuable than understanding them at the time. Sometimes the hands know first and the heart follows and the mind comes last, and all of them together arrive, eventually, at the same place. "Come inside," he said. "The fire will need building up." She smiled at him, the smile he had been earning since November of 1882 and earning every day since, and took his hand. They walked back to the cabin together through the first snow of the winter, and the light in the windows grew as they approached it, warm and certain, the light of a house that is fully inhabited, a life that is fully shared. Inside, Thomas was at the table with a book. Clara was on the floor with a set of carved wooden animals Samuel had made for her birthday, conducting some elaborate drama of her own invention. Joseph was asleep in the back room, audibly. Ed Torres had already gone to the bunkhouse, and Samuel was banking the fire in the parlor stove. Frederick went to the kitchen stove and opened the grate and added 2 pieces of split oak from the wood box, and the fire took them with the sound of something established and reliable. And Eudora stood in the doorway watching him do it with the expression she had described to him once, a long time ago, when they had been talking late on a winter night about the day she had arrived. She had said that she had watched him turn to light the stove before she had finished asking, and something had happened in her that she had not expected. Something that was different from hope, because hope has desperation in it. Something closer to recognition, as if her body had understood before her mind had processed it that this was the particular kind of man she had been looking for without knowing what she was looking for. He had listened to her describe it and had said, "I did not know I was ready. I thought I had sealed that room." "You had," she said, "but some rooms seal from the inside, and the seal only holds as long as nothing on the outside makes it worth opening." He had thought about that for a long time after, and he thought about it now, closing the grate on the stove, the fire burning steadily and warm, his children in the next room, his wife in the doorway, the snow falling outside on the land that was theirs. Some rooms seal from the inside, and the right knock at the right door in the first snow of the right winter is all it takes. Eudora came into the kitchen and stood beside him, and they both looked at the burning stove for a moment. And then she said, quietly, so the children would not hear, "I love you, Frederick Wells." He put his arm around her and pulled her close against his side and looked at the fire that had been burning, one way or another, since the night she had arrived. "I have loved you," he said, "since before I knew I was going to." The stove burned warm through the long Wyoming night, through the years that came after, through the winters and springs and the children growing and the cattle multiplying, and the land being what it had always been, vast and indifferent and breathtaking, and the cabin was full of warmth and noise and the daily evidence of a life properly lived. And outside the snow fell and the aspens stood silver in the cold, and the stars over Wyoming were the same stars that had always been there, watching everything. Indifferent to the small dramas of men and women making their lives in the space between all that enormous sky and all that enormous land, except that the dramas are not small, not really. Because the lighting of a stove for one particular woman on one particular snowy November evening was, in its way, as consequential as anything the stars had seen in their long watching. Thomas Wells grew up to be a man of both his parents, which is to say a man with his mother's intelligence and his father's hands and a temperament that was entirely his own, combining the best qualities of both. He took over the management of the ranch alongside his father in his early 20s and expanded it in ways that neither Frederick nor Eudora had anticipated but both recognized as right. Clara Wells became a teacher in the same Harlan schoolhouse where she had first been educated, and had the particular gift of making children believe in their own capacity that the best teachers always have. Joseph Wells, the determined youngest, went eventually to the territorial capital, and then beyond it, building a different kind of thing than cattle, but never losing the quality of his upbringing, which was a belief in the value of honest work and the willingness to tend the fires that matter. Frederick and Eudora were together for more than 30 years, and the years did what years do to people who live well in them, which is to add depth and quiet, and a kind of settled joy that is different from the electric thing of the beginning but is not less, is more in many ways, because it has history in it and endurance and the knowledge of having come through things together. Frederick's hair went silver and then white, and his face became the face of a man who has spent decades in weather, and Eudora's dark hair gained its own silver threads, and the lines around her eyes, were the lines of a woman who has laughed and squinted at the horizon and been fully alive in the sun of a long Wyoming life. In the evenings, in the years when the children were grown and the operation was running on the strength of the next generation, they sat by the same stove that had been burning since the first snow of 1882, and she read to him, or they talked, or they were quiet together in the way that people who have known each other for decades can be quiet without it meaning anything except that they are there, fully present, requiring nothing more. He never stopped lighting the stove. Every cold morning of every winter for the rest of his life, the first thing Frederick Wells did was go to the stove and open the grate and lay the fire, and sometimes he would be aware, doing it, of the memory of November 1882, of the woman standing in the door in the snow with her carpetbags, still speaking, still asking, and his hands already moving to answer her. He had not done it for company in 8 winters. He had been doing it for her ever since. And the fire burned and the cabin held them, and outside the Wyoming sky was the biggest sky in the world, and they were small in it, and warm and whole.